Hello, YouTube, and welcome to Level-Headed News. This is your host, Brenda. I have 6 articles for you in this episode, and all the URLs are in the description of the video for your convenience. The first one here is off of Daily Mail, and it says Pearl Harbor 2 for a preemptive military bases, which would cripple American forces in the region. Of satellite imagery compares China's missile testing grounds and U.S. military bases. So that the tests, try this again. The images show that the tests have been designed to look like military bases, according to the report. Earlier this week, a highly accurate Chinese capable of threatening the U.S. and Japan bases in Asia made its latest appearance. DF-16 featured a video posted last week. China appeared to be planning a missile attack on the U.S. military bases in the Pacific have been detailed in a new report. The investigation of satellite imagery compared China's missile testing grounds and U.S. military bases shows a pattern. Have been aimed at destroying U.S. carriers, destroyers, and airfields in East Asia, the report said. Show that the test areas have been designed to look like the military bases, according to the report by Thomas Schugert on Rocks. Earlier this week, a highly accurate Chinese ballistic missile capable of threatening U.S. and Japan bases in Asia made its latest appearance, rocket force drills. And there is a video in this if you want to pull it up and take a look at it. Pictures and maps and that sort of thing. Get it to scroll up here for the hamster is wearing thin. Poor little guy. Every once in a while, I think he has to stop just to catch his breath. Okay. The medium-range DF-16 featured in a video posted last week on the Defense Ministry's website showing the missiles aboard their 10-wheeled mobile launch vehicles being deployed in deep forests during exercises over the concluded Lunar New Year holiday. While the rocket force extensive armory of missiles of various ranges, the DF-16 fills a particular role in extending China's reach over waters it seeks to control within what it calls the First Island Chain. At a Beijing military parade in 2015, the missile is believed to have a range of 1,000 kilometers, which is 620 miles. Striking distance of Okinawa, home to several U.S. military installations, as well as the Japanese home islands, Taiwan and the Philippines. The two-stage DF-16 replaces the older, shorter-range DF-11 stage that can adjust its trajectory to strike slow-moving targets and evade anti-missile defenses such as the U.S. Patriot missiles or the U.S. Patriot system deployed. And there's some more pictures here. Satellite images. And I'm trying to get her to scroll. Come on, hamster. A little bit more. Well, there's quite a few pictures here. There we go. That went a little too far. It also carries up to 3 warheads weighing as much as a ton and carrying conventional high explosives or a nuclear weapon. Its lethality. The missile is believed to be accurate to within as little as 5 meters, which is 16 feet, of the target, similar to that of the cruise missile. The most active ballistic missile development program in the world, according to CSIS.org. Before taking office, President Donald Trump questioned Washington's one China policy that shifted diplomatic recognition from self-governing Taiwan to China in 1979. He said it was open to negotiation, but former U.S. officials and scholars said in a report that such an approach could destabilize the Asian Pacific and leave Taiwan more vulnerable. And there's some more satellite views. U.S.-China relations are at precious crossroads, and the two world powers could be on a collision course, it said, describing a rivalry that is growing amid Beijing's assertion of territorial claims in the disputed South and East China Seas. China has bristled at the One China comments, wants to pressure Beijing to narrow its huge trade surplus with the United States. Beijing also warned of instability after Trump's Defense Secretary Jim Mattis said last week on a trip to the region that a U.S. commitment to defend Japanese territory applies to the group that China claims. The Trump administration has cast its China policy as part of a peace through strength approach. That information. The next one I have is off of Bloomberg. And waiting for the hamster. Hamster's running slow this morning. Okay, here we go. Starting to come up here. Prominent Republicans pitch carbon tax plan to top Trump aides. And there's some video in this if you want to pull it up to take a look at it. Waiting for the hamster. Running in the wheel to bring up the article. There we go. A group of prominent Republicans and business leaders pitched a tax on carbon dioxide to top White House aides Wednesday. And, well, now I've got to wait for the hamster again. Here we go. Selling the plan is an economic win that could drive job growth and yield environmental dividends too. Former Secretary of State James Baker and other members of the new Climate Leadership Council pressed the case in a 45-minute meeting in the Roosevelt Room that includes President Donald Trump's top economic advisor, Gary Cohn, Chief of Staff Reince Priebus, and the senior aide, Kellyanne Conway. The signs were very encouraging. Ted Halstad, the council, said after the meeting, 2 weeks into this new administration, we have positioned our solution as the most promising climate solution if they want to go there. Baker also met briefly with Vice President Mike Pence as the old guard Republicans try to persuade the Trump administration that carbon tax imposing in exchange for abolishing a slew of environmental regulations is an insurance policy against the risks of climate change. We know we have an uphill slog to get Republicans interested in this, Baker said before the White House meeting, but a conservative free market approach is very Republican way of approaching the problem. White House spokesman Sean Spicer declined to comment on the idea. The Republican and business leaders lent to an approach for addressing climate change that mirrors an idea already advanced by ExxonMobil Corporation. Supporters say the tax is a conservative solution to climate change that replaces a regulatory regime with a free market approach for addressing the greenhouse gas emissions. The group includes Hank Paulson, who served as Treasury Secretary under President George W. Bush and previously has advocated a carbon tax through his eponymous think tank, the Paulson Institute, who served as Secretary of State and Treasury under 2 Republican administrations. Other members include former Secretary of State George Shultz, Sequoia Capital Operations LLC partner Thomas Stevenson, and former chairman of the board of Walmart Stores Incorporated, Rob Walton. To former presidents George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan also are involved in the effort. Baker himself concedes he remains somewhat of a skeptic about the extent to which man is responsible for climate change, but the risks are too great to ignore. The plan faces political headwinds. Both Trump and majority of the House of Representatives have come out against a carbon tax in the past year. Trump also has pledged to do away with environmental regulations limiting emissions of carbon dioxide. But the idea of a carbon tax, long favored by economists, forward way to address climate change, could gain traction as part of a broad tax overhaul on Capitol Hill. The blueprint involves a $40 tax on every metric ton of carbon dioxide released by burning fossil fuels, with the price climbing over time. To avoid an undue burden on the poor from higher energy bills that would result, the projected $200 billion to $300 billion in annual revenue would be redistributed to households in the form of quarterly checks from the Social Security Administration. Families of four would see an average annual payout of $2,000 under the plan, they say. The proposal also calls for border adjustments that would act to hike the cost of products imported from countries that do not put a price on carbon. The tax would be imposed at the point fossil fuels enter the economy, such as when oil leaves the refinery or coal leaves the mine. In exchange, regulations aimed at cutting emissions would be eliminated. The Republican-led House last June approved a non-binding resolution condemning the idea of a carbon tax as detrimental to American families and businesses. The measure, 137 to 163, was designed to lock in lawmakers' positions, making it harder for those who lodged a vote opposing a tax to support one later on. Trump himself has come out against the idea, rejecting a carbon tax in response to a survey by the American Energy Alliance last March. Many of the conservative advocates of energy and environment policy also eschew the idea. The approach also runs counter to Trump's campaign promises to help bring back coal mining jobs, because it generates more carbon dioxide emissions than natural gas and oil. Coal would be fossil fuel hardest hit by a tax on carbon. That with the foundation laid now, lawmakers could seize on carbon tax as a potential source of revenue to offset rate reductions during a future congressional debate on overhauling the tax code. This is not a climate proposal, it's a tax proposal, said Thomas Pyle, head of the free market advocacy group American Energy Alliance. There is no need to trade Obama's climate regulations for a carbon tax. Trump has already promised to undo them. The next article is off of BizPac Review. It says, Muslim American activist says unhinged leftists U.S. image in Muslim world, and it's dangerous. Refugee protesters may think they're trying to help America's image in the Islamic world, but one Muslim American author and activist is arguing that the effect of their actions could very well be quite the opposite. Appearing on Your World with guest host Maria Romero, Ezra Nomani explained that the left's unhinged reactions to what most Americans consider reasonable policies, such as temporarily restricting immigration from specific American failed states, is causing the left to lose in the court of public opinion. Nomani pointed out that dangerous rhetoric on social media, as well as violent protests such as what happened in Berkeley last week, actually embolden our enemies overseas because it paints America as hostile to Muslims, when in reality the administration is simply taking steps to properly vet and keep out the extremists among them. Is that the left is in fact cooperating with this narrative. that America is hostile to Muslims. Nomani said, I am a Muslim. I feel more safe in this country than I do in any Muslim country in the world. The left is right now triumphant about the idea that it court, she continued, but I do believe deeply in my heart as a lifelong liberal that the left is losing in the court of public opinion. Mani reiterates that they lost and should stop with this humiliation that it is constantly trying to do and allow the party that has won to govern in a way which would serve our country. Rhetoric and actions hurt America's standing among the majority of Muslim countries. It could also cause further Democratic losses in 2018. Americans cast their ballots against this type of civil disobedience and civil disturbance that has unfortunately ripped of America. And there's a video of this if you want to take a look at it to say. The next one's off of Conservative Tribune, and it says Delta Force Master reveals why Trump is not responsible for the operation where the Navy SEAL died. And there we go. It says the Delta Force member has spoken out against the mainstream media for trying to blame Donald Trump administration for raids in Yemen that killed Navy SEAL, the Independent Journal Review reported. Publication, Army Delta Force operator Green Beret and Master Sergeant Dale Comstock said the media perception of fighting terrorists was completely different from reality. Chief Petty Officer Ryan William Owens, a Navy SEAL, was killed during the January 19th raid against al-Qaeda targets. Much of the media has no effing clue what they're talking about, Comstock said. I've been to over 70 countries in the world as a soldier, security consultant, and civilian. I've been to every country in the Middle East. Yemen is one of the most dangerous countries on the planet. Syria is the most dangerous country in the Middle East. Yemen is. Most roads in Yemen have manned checkpoints, he continued. Troops at every checkpoint. There is al-Qaeda, ISIS, the Houthis, funded by Iran. The streets aren't safe. If you have a white face on the streets of Yemen, it's a death sentence. High chance that you will get captured and killed. And there's some video in this if you want to pull it up to take a look at that. And the article continues here. That doesn't seem to fit in with the media's reports on Yemen. Here are just some of the headlines. Trump wasn't in room for botched Yemen raid that killed civilians and U.S. Navy SEAL, which has no doubt published its right to the next 62 kinky steps to keep your man hungry for more. Pitch botched Yemen raid on Barack Obama falters, Huffington Post role, and President Trump's disastrous first military operation ordered without sufficient intelligence. Salon, which has not itself sufficient intelligence since Chris Hitchens stopped submitting to them shortly after 9/11. Trump for Yemen do not understand. I've been on several, and sometimes the worst case scenario is what happens, Comstock said. They don't have any idea on wrong, how complex the planning was, and if anyone on the SEAL team made a mistake, he continued. To blame it on Trump is more than short-sighted. He doesn't control the forces on the ground, and he has enough respect for our military that he professionals who he chose to lead the greatest fight force on the planet. Navy SEAL is a sad occasion indeed, but to blame it on a new president is beyond irresponsible, at least as Delta Force operator Dale Comstock sees it. The next article is off of World Journalism. And it says potential top cites partisan opposition and withdraws. One of the finalists in the Post Solicitor General has, rather than dip his toe into the toxic stew that Senate Democrats have made of the confirmation process, Thursday. He no longer wishes to be considered for the post. His withdrawal leaves George Conway, the husband of White House counselor Kellyanne Conway, as the only remaining finalist. He represents the government in cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. As the Trump administration faces what could be the first major Supreme Court case, reinstatement of Trump's executive order temporarily banning residents terror-prone nations after it was blocked by a federal court. I am deeply honored by any consideration that I may have received by Attorney General Sessions and President Trump for appointment as the Solicitor General, but I have been asked, but I have asked them to discontinue any further consideration of me for the critical, important position, Cooper said in a statement on Thursday. After witnessing the treatment that my friend Jeff Sessions, a decent and honorable man, only goodwill and good cheer to everyone he meets, at the hands of partisan opposition, will say anything and do anything to advance their political interests. I am unwilling to subject myself to such a program, his statement said. Up his feelings in a later interview. Too good and too short, said Cooper, who had helped Sessions prepare for his confirmation hearings to become Attorney General. Trump has not made a formal nomination. As reported by Western journalism, George Conway's name has been discussed for the post since December. Conway is partner at the New York City law firm Lipton, Rosen, and Katz. I'm trying to see if there's more to this here. Go scroll up. Yes, there is. And it went too far. Chicken or feathers. Poor little hamster. He's confused. Here we go. During the administration of President Bill Clinton, Conway was involved in the Paula Jones case, which set the legal precedent that allowed a sitting president to be sued in civil court. A brilliant and accomplished lawyer who is willing to serve this president. At the same time, I've been quiet about specific roles for him, partly because of my role here and because the Attorney General has not been confirmed, Kellyanne Conway has said. He's willing to serve, and I know that's a decision he's made. He would be the first Asian Solicitor General, but he could also be a judge. George Conway has not commented about the post or his possible selection. And the final one in this episode is off of UNZ.com. John McCain. When Tokyo Rose ran for president, what was John McCain's true wartime record in Vietnam? Although the memory has faded in recent years, during much of the second half of the 20th century, the name Tokyo Rose ranked very high in our popular consciousness, probably second only to Benedict Arnold as a byword for American treachery during wartime. The story of Iva Akano Togarai, American woman who spent her wartime years broadcasting popular music laced with enemy propaganda to our suffering troops in the Pacific Theater, was well known to everyone, and her trial for treason after the war, which stripped her of her citizenship and sentenced her to a long prison term, made national headlines. The actual historical facts seem to have been somewhat different than the popular myth. Tokyo Rose, there were actually several such female broadcasters, with Miss Togarai not even being the earliest, and their identities merged in the minds of the embattled American GIs. But she was the only one ever brought to trial and punished, although her own radio commentary turned out to have been almost totally innocuous. The plight of a young American-born woman alone on a family visit who became trapped behind enemy lines by the sudden outbreak of war was obviously a difficult one, and desperately taking a job as an English language music announcer hardly fits the unusual notion of treason. Indeed, after her release from federal prison, she avoided deportation and spent the rest of her life quietly running a grocery shop in Chicago. Post-war Japan soon became our closest ally in Asia, and once wartime passions had sufficiently cooled, she was eventually pardoned by President Gerald Ford and had her U.S. citizenship restored. Despite these extremely mitigating circumstances, uh, in Miss Togarai's particular case, we should not be too surprised at America's harsh treatment of the poor woman upon her return home from Japan. All normal countries ruthlessly punish treason and traitors, and these terms are often expansively declined in an aftermath of a bitter war. Perhaps in topsy-turvy Monty Python world, wartime traitors would be given medals feted at the White House and become national heroes, but any real-life country that allowed such insanity would surely be set on the road to oblivion. If Tokyo Rose's wartime record had launched her on a successful American political career and nearly gave her the presidency, we would know that for a fact some cruel enemy had spiked our national water supply with LSD. The political rise of Senator John McCain leads me to suspect that the 1970s, some cruel enemy had spiked our national water supply with LSD. My earliest recollection of John McCain are vague. I think he first came to my attention during the mid-1980s, perhaps after 1982, when he won an open congressional seat in Arizona, or more likely once he was elected in 1986 to the U.S. Senate seat of retiring conservative icon Barry Goldwater. All media accounts about him seem strongly favorable, describing his steadfastness as a POW during more than 5 grim years of torture by his Vietnamese jailers, with the extent of his wartime physical suffering indicated by the famous photo showing him still on crutches as he was greeted by President Nixon many months after his return from enemy captivity. I never had the slightest doubt about this story or his war hero status. McCain's public image took a beating at the end of the 1980s when he became one of the senators caught up in the Keating Five financial scandal, but he managed to survive that controversy unlike most of the others. Soon thereafter, he became prominent as the leading national advocate of campaign finance reform, a strong pro-immigrant voice, and also a chairman of normalizing our relations with Vietnam, positions that appeal to me as much as they did to the national media. By 2000, my opinion had become sufficiently favorable that I donated to his underdog challenge to Governor George W. Bush in the Republican primaries of that year, and was thrilled when he did surprisingly well in some of the early contests and suddenly had a serious shot at the nomination. However, he then suffered an unexpected defeat in South Carolina as the large block of local military voters swung decisively against him. According to widespread media reports, the main cause was an utterly scurrilous whispering campaign by Karl Rove and his henchmen, which even included appalling accusations that the great war hero candidate had been a traitor in Vietnam. My only conclusion was that filthy lies, sometimes found in American politics, were even worse than I'd ever imagined. Aftermath of 9/11 attacks, I turned sharply against McCain due to his support for an extremely bellicose foreign policy. I never had any reason to question his background or his integrity, and my strong opposition to his 2008 presidential run was entirely on policy grounds. I feared his notoriously hot temper might easily get us into additional disastrous wars. Everything suddenly changed in June of 2008 when I read a long article by an unfamiliar writer on the Leftist Counterpunch website. Shocking claims were made that McCain may never have been tortured and that he instead spent his wartime captivity collaborating with his captors and broadcasting communist propaganda a possibility that seemed almost incomprehensible to me, given all the thousands of contrary articles that I had absorbed over the decades from the mainstream media. How could this one article on a small website be the truth about McCain's war record and everything else be total falsehood? The evidence was hardly overwhelming, with the piece being thinly sourced and written in a meandering fashion by an obscure author, but the claims were so astonishing that I had some sort of, try that again. The claims were so astonishing that I made some effort to investigate the matter, though without any real success. However, those new doubts about McCain were still in my mind a few months later when I stumbled upon Sidney Schanberg's massively documented expose about McCain's role in the POWMIA cover-up, a vastly greater scandal. This time I was presented with a mountain of hard evidence gathered by one of America's greatest wartime journalists, a Pulitzer Prize-winning former top editor at the New York Times. In the years since then, other leading journalists have praised Scannenberg's remarkable research, now giving his conclusions the combined backing of 4 New York Times Pulitzer Prizes, while 2 former Republican congressmen who had served on the Intelligence Committee have also strongly corroborated his account. In 1993, the front page of the New York Times broke the story that a Politburo transcript found in the Kremlin archives fully confirmed the existence of the additional POWs. And when interviewed on the PBS NewsHour, former National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger and Sig, I don't know if I can pronounce this, Zbigniew Brzezinski admitted that the document was very likely correct and that hundreds of America's Vietnam POWs had indeed been left behind. In my opinion, the reality of Schanberg's POW story is now about as solidly established as anything can be that has not yet received an official blessing from the American mainstream media. And the total dishonesty of the media regarding both the POW story and McCain's leading role in the latter cover-up soon made me very suspicious of all those other claims regarding John McCain's supposedly heroic war record. Our American bravada is simply not to be trusted on any touchy topics. I have no personal knowledge of the Vietnam War myself, nor do I possess expertise in that area of history. But after encountering Schanberg's expose in 2008, I soon got in touch with someone having exactly those strengths, a Vietnam veteran who later became a professor at one of our military service academies. At first, he was quite cagey regarding the questions I raised, but once he had read through Schanberg's lengthy article, he felt he could respond more freely, and he largely confirmed the claims, partly based on certain information he personally possessed. He said he found it astonishing that in these days of the internet, the POW scandal had not attracted vastly more attention, and couldn't understand why the media was so uniformly unwilling to touch the topic. He also had some very interesting things to say about John McCain's wartime record. According to him, it was hardly a secret in veteran circles that McCain had spent much of the war producing communist propaganda broadcasts, since these had regularly been played in the prisoner camps as a means of breaking the spirits of those American POWs who resisted collaboration. Instead, he and some of his friends had speculated about who currently possessed copies of McCain's damning audio and videotapes and wondered whether they might come out during the course of the presidential campaign. Over the years, other Vietnam veterans have publicly leveled similar charges, and Schanberg had speculated that McCain's leading role in the POW cover-up might have been connected with the pressure he faced due to his notorious wartime broadcasts. In late September of 2008, another fascinating story appeared in my morning New York Times. An intrepid reporter decided to visit Vietnam and see what McCain's former jailers thought of the possibility that their one-time captive might soon reach the White House. That the man they had spent years brutally torturing could become the next president of the United States. To the journalist's apparent amazement, the former jailer seemed enthusiastic about the prospects of a McCain victory, saying that they hoped he would win since they had become such good friends during the war and had worked so closely together. If they lived in America, they'd certainly all vote for him. When asked about McCain's claims of cruel, sadistic torture, the head of the guard unit dismissed those stories as being just the sort of total nonsense that politicians, whether in America or in Vietnam, must often sprout in order to win popularity. BBC correspondents reported the same statements. Let us consider the implications of this story. Throughout his entire life, John McCain has been notable for having very violent temper and also for holding deep grudges. How plausible does it seem that men who allegedly spent years torturing him would be so eager to see him reach a position in supreme world power? But what about the famous photo showing McCain still on crutches even months after his release from captivity? In 2008, someone discovered archival footage from a Swedish news crew which had filmed a return of the POWs and uploaded it to YouTube. We see a healthy-looking John McCain walking off the plane from Vietnam having a noticeable limp, but certainly for crutches. After returning home, he had eventually entered Bethesda Naval Hospital for corrective surgery on some of his wartime injuries, and that recent American surgery was what explained his crutches in the photo with Nixon. It is certainly knowledgeable, or try this again. It is certainly acknowledged that considerable numbers of American POWs were indeed tortured in Vietnam, but it is far from clear that McCain was ever one of them. As the original Counterpunch article pointed out, throughout most or almost the entire war, McCain was held at a special section for the best behaving prisoners, at which there were, try this again, which was where he allegedly produced his communist propaganda broadcasts and perhaps became such good friends with his guards as they later claimed. Top-ranking former POWs held at the same prison, such as Colonels Ted Guy and Gordon Swede Larson, have gone on the record saying that they are very skeptical regarding McCain's claims of torture. I've taken the trouble to read through John McCain's earliest claims of his harsh imprisonment, a highly detailed 12,000-word first-person account published under his name in the U.S. News and World Report in May of 1973, just a few weeks after his release from imprisonment. The editorial introduction notes the almost total recall seemingly just demonstrated by the young pilot just out of captivity. And portions of the story strike me as doubtful, perhaps drawn from the long history of popular imprisonment fiction stretching back to Dumas' Count of Monte Cristo. Would a young Navy pilot so easily develop and remember a tap code to extensively communicate with others across thick prison walls? And McCain describes himself as having a philosophical bent, spending his years of solitary confinement reviewing in his head all the many history books he had read, trying to make sense of human history, a degree of intellectualizing never apparent in his life either before or after. One fatal detail routinely emphasized by his supporters is his repeated claim that excerpt for signing a single written statement very early in his captivity, and also answering some questions by a visiting French newsman, used any hint of collaboration with his captors despite torture, solitary confinement, endless threats of beatings, and offers of rewards. Perhaps, but that original Counterpunch article provided the link to the purported text pro-Hanoi propaganda broadcast as summarized in a 1969 UPI wire service story. And I have confirmed its authenticity by locating the resulting article that ran in Stars and Stripes at the same time. So if critical portions of McCain's account of his imprisonment are seemingly revealed to be self-serving fiction, how much of the rest can we believe? If his pro-communist propaganda broadcasts were so notable that the news pages of one of America's leading military publications, it seems quite plausible that they were as numerous, substantial, and frequent as his critics allege. When I later discussed these troubling matters with an eminent political scientist who has something of a military background, he emphasized that McCain's history can only be understood in the context of his father, a top-ranking admiral who then served as commander of all American forces in the Pacific Theater, including our troops in Vietnam. Indeed, the alleged headline of UPI Wire story had been "Prisoner of War Songbird is pilot son of the Admiral," highlighting that connection. Obviously, for reasons both family loyalty and personal standing, it would have been imperative for John McCain's father and namesake to hush up the terrible scandal of having had his son serve as leading collaborator and communist propagandist during the war, and his exalted rank gave him the power to do so. Furthermore, just a few years earlier, the elder McCain had himself perform as extremely valuable service for America political elites, organizing the official board of inquiry that whitewashed the potentially devastating Liberty incident with its hundreds of dead and wounded American servicemen. So he certainly had some powerful had some powerful political chicks he could call in. Placed in this context, John McCain's tales of torture make perfect sense. If he had indeed spent almost the entire war eagerly broadcasting communist propaganda in exchange for favored treatment, then there would have been stories about this circulating in private, and fears that these tales might eventually reach the newspaper headlines, perhaps backed by hard evidence of audio and videotapes. An effective strategy for preempting this danger would be to concoct lurid tales of personal sufferings and then promote them in the media, quickly establishing McCain as highest profile victim of torture among America's returned POWs, an effort rendered credible by the fact that many American POWs had indeed suffered torture. Once the public had fully accepted McCain as our foremost Vietnam War hero and torture victim, any later release of his propaganda tapes would be dismissed as merely providing that even the bravest of men had their breaking point. Given that McCain's father was one of America's highest-ranking military officers, and both the Nixon administration and the media had soon elevated McCain to a national symbol of American heroism, there would have been enormous pressure on the other returning POWs, many of them dazed and injured after long captivity, not to undercut such an important patriotic narrative. Similarly, for Congress and Senate, a decade or so later, stories of his torture became central theme of his campaigns, and once again constituted a powerful defense against any possible rumors of his alleged disloyalty. And so the legend grew over the decades until it completely swallowed the man, and he became America's greatest patriot and war hero, with almost no one even being aware of the communist propaganda broadcast that had motivated the story in the first place. I have sometimes noticed this same historical pattern in which fictional accounts, originally invented to excuse or migrate some of the enormous crimes, may eventually expand over time until they totally dominate the narrative, while the original crime itself is nearly forgotten. The central theme of McCain's presidential campaign was his unmatched patriotism, and when he went down to defeat at the hands of Barack Obama, the widespread verdict that the greatest of war heroes may still lose an election. I must reemphasize that I am not an expert on the Vietnam War, nor my cursory investigation is nothing like the sort of exhaustive research that would be necessary to establish a firm conclusion on this troubling case. I have merely tried to provide a plausible account of McCain's war record and highlight some of the important pieces of evidence that thorough research that a more thorough researcher could consider. Unlike the documentation of the POW cover-up accumulated by Schonsberg and others, which I regard as overwhelmingly conclusive, I think the best that may be said about my reconstruction of McCain's wartime history is that it seems more likely correct. However, I should mention that when I discussed some of these items with Schonsberg in 2010 and suggested that John McCain had been the Tokyo Rose of the Vietnam War, he considered it very apt description. John McCain is hardly the only prominent political figure those problematic Vietnam War activities have at times come under harsh scrutiny, but afterwards been airbrushed away and forgotten by our subservient, just as McCain was widely regarded as the most prominent Republican war hero of that conflict. His Democratic counterpart was probably Vietnam Medal of Honor winner Bob Kerrey, a former Nebraska governor and senator who had run for president in 1992 and then considered doing so again in the 1990s. His seemingly unblemished record of wartime heroism suddenly collapsed in 2001 with the publication of a devastating 8,000-word expose in the New York Times Magazine, together with a 60 Minutes 2 television segment. Detailed eyewitness testimonies and documentary evidence persuasively establishing that Kerry had ordered his men to massacre over a dozen innocent Vietnamese civilians, women, children, and infants, for being witnesses to his botched SEAL raid on a tiny Vietnamese hamlet in an action that somewhat recalled the infamous My Lai massacre of the previous year, though certainly on a much smaller scale. Kerry's initial response to these horrific accusations that his memory of the incident was foggy struck me as near certain proof of his guilt, and others drew similar conclusions. As a supposed war hero and a moderate Democrat, Kerry had always been very popular in political circles, but even the new Republican was shocked by the atrocity with which pundits and the media sought to absolve him of his apparent crimes. The revelations also seem to have had no impact on his tenure as president of the prestigious New School in New York, institution with an impeccable liberal reputation, which he held for another decade before leaving to make an unsuccessful attempt to recapture his old Senate seat. Bob Dreyfus, a principal left liberal journalist, might still characterize him as a mass murderer in 2012 blog post at The Nation, but for years almost no one in the mainstream media had ever alluded to the incident in any of the articles mentioning Kerry's activities, just as the media has also totally ignored all of Schanberg's remarkable revelations. Kerry's war crimes have almost totally vanished from public consciousness. We must always draw an important distinction between the actions of individual journalists and their behavior of the American media taken as a whole. I believe that the overwhelming majority of reporters and editors are honest and sincere, and although their coverage may sometimes be slanted or mistaken, they do seek to inform rather than to mislead. Consider how many of the explosive facts discussed above or in Schanberg's massive expose were drawn directly from Times and other leading media outlets. But after those crucial stories run, the facts have established often seem to vanish from subsequent coverage, causing them to be forgotten by most casual readers. Thus, the detailed account of Kerry's apparent massacre of civilians received the greatest possible initial coverage, a huge cover story in the New York Times Magazine and top-rated CBS News television segment, but within a year or so, the history had seemingly been flushed down the memory hole by almost all political reporters. The facts are still available for interested readers to uncover, but they must do the work themselves rather than simply relying on the summary narratives produced by the mainstream publications. That many of our political leaders may be harboring such terrible personal secrets that our media outlets regularly conceal, raises an important policy implication independent of the particular secrets themselves. In recent years, I have recently begun to suspect that some or even many of our national leaders may occasionally make their seemingly inexplicable policy decisions under the looming threat of personal blackmail, and that this may have also been true in the past. Consider the intriguing case of J. Edgar Hoover, who spent nearly half a century running our domestic intelligence service, the FBI. Over those many decades, he accumulated detailed files on vast numbers of prominent people, and most historians agree that he regularly used such highly sensitive material to gain the upper hand in disputes with his nominal political masters, and also to bend other public figures to his will. Meanwhile, he himself was hardly immune from similar pressures. These days, it is widely believed that Hoover lived his long life as a deeply closeted homosexual, and there are also serious claims that he had some hidden black ancestry, a possibility that seems quite plausible to me given his features. Such deep personal secrets, Hoover's long denials that organized crime actually existed in America, and his great reluctance to allocate significant FBI resources to combat it. Today, when we consider the major countries of the world, in many cases, the official leaders are also the leaders in actuality. Vladimir Putin calls the shots in Russia. Xi Jinping and his top Politburo colleagues do the same in China, and so forth. However, in America and in some other Western countries, this seems to be less and less the case, with top national figures merely being attractive frontmen selected for their popular appeal and their political malleability, a development that many eventually have dire consequences for the nations they lead. As an extreme example, a drunken Boris Yeltsin freely allowed the looting of Russia's entire national wealth by the handful of oligarchs strings, and the result was total impoverishment of the Russian people and a demographic collapse almost unprecedented in modern peacetime history. An obvious problem with the installing puppet rulers is the risk that they will attempt to cut their strings, much like Putin soon outmaneuvered and exiled his oligarch patron Boris Berezovsky. One means of minimizing such risk is to select puppets who are so deeply compromised that they can never break free, knowing that the political self-destruct charges buried deep within their past could easily be triggered if they sought independence. I have sometimes joked with my friends that perhaps the best career move for an ambitious young politician would be to secretly commit some monstrous crime and then make sure that his guilt ended up in the hands of certain powerful people, thereby assuring his rapid political rise. Such notions may seem utterly absurd, but let us step back and consider recent American history. Just a few years ago, an individual came very close to reaching the White House almost entirely on the strength of his war record that considerable evidence suggests was actually the sort that would normally get military men hanged for treason at the close of hostilities. I have studied many historical eras and many countries, and no parallel examples come to mind. Perhaps the cause of this bizarre situation merely lies in the remarkable incompetence and cowardice of our major media organs, their herd mentality, and their insouciant unwillingness to notice evidence that is staring them in the face. But we should also at least consider the possibility of darker explanation. If Tokyo Rose had nearly been president in the 1980s, we would assume that the American political system had taken a very turn. That's all I have in this episode, but there will be more to follow. If you like what I'm doing, give it a thumbs up. Share it on your social media so everybody gets to hear the news. And subscribe if you haven't done that yet, and that way you'll stay informed.